For 12 years, the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast watched his wife leave their home for exactly 1 hour on their wedding anniversary. And for 12 years, he never asked where she went. Adrian Moretti questioned everything in his world because questions kept powerful men alive. He questioned financial reports, security routes, business partners, body language, and every silence that lingered too long in a room. Nothing escaped his attention. Rivals feared his instincts more than his influence, because Adrian noticed details that others dismissed. Yet, the one mystery he willingly ignored belonged to the woman sleeping beside him every night. Emma Moretti always left at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the date they celebrated their marriage. She never carried luggage, never dressed differently, never seemed nervous, and never returned a minute late. She would kiss his cheek, smile with the same quiet warmth that had first made him fall in love with her, whisper, "I'll be back soon," and disappear for exactly 60 minutes before returning, as though the day had been completely ordinary. Adrian had convinced himself that love required trust, and trust sometimes meant allowing another person to keep a corner of their soul untouched. Perhaps he believed that because he had so many locked rooms inside his own heart. Their marriage had never exploded into dramatic arguments or spectacular betrayals. Instead, it had faded so gradually that neither of them could identify the exact moment silence became more common than laughter. Adrian spent more nights protecting an empire than protecting conversations. Emma stopped asking him to come home early because she already knew the answer before the question left her lips. They still shared breakfast whenever schedules allowed, still celebrated birthdays, still remembered anniversaries, but somewhere beneath those rituals, something gentle had quietly slipped away. On the morning of their 13th anniversary, the mansion felt unusually still. Sunlight spilled across polished wooden floors while waves crashed softly against the distant shoreline beyond the cliffs. Emma prepared coffee exactly the way Adrian liked it, without asking whether he still preferred it that way. He thanked her without looking up from the report spread across the dining table. They exchanged polite smiles that belonged to two kind strangers rather than two people who had once promised forever. Shortly before 4 o'clock, Emma walked upstairs and returned carrying a small wooden box worn smooth by time. Adrian frowned almost imperceptibly. He had never seen it before. The box looked old, handcrafted, its corners softened by years of careful handling. She held it close against her chest for only a moment before slipping it into a canvas satchel. "I'll be back before dinner," she said gently. Adrian nodded. "Drive safely." She leaned down, kissed his cheek, and left the mansion without another word. The front door closed with a quiet click that somehow echoed through the entire house. Adrian remained seated for several seconds, pretending to read the documents before him, but every sentence dissolved into the same image of the weathered wooden box. Why today did it bother him? Why after 12 years? Perhaps because lately he had begun noticing how much of Emma's life existed beyond the edges of his attention. He realized he no longer knew which novels she loved, which music she listened to while he worked late, or why sadness occasionally lingered behind her smile before disappearing whenever she caught him watching. His phone vibrated repeatedly with messages from executives requesting urgent approvals. Without thinking, he silenced every notification, picked up his keys, and walked toward the garage. He kept a careful distance as Emma drove along the coastal highway, her car winding through roads bordered by cliffs and restless water, until the city disappeared completely behind them. Eventually she turned onto a narrow gravel path almost hidden beneath overgrown trees. Adrian parked far enough away to avoid being seen and continued on foot. Ahead stood an abandoned lighthouse overlooking the Atlantic, its faded white walls scarred by decades of salt, rain, and neglect. No tourists visited anymore. No maintenance crews came. Only wind and seabirds seemed to remember the place. Emma climbed the path with quiet confidence, as though she had walked it countless times before. She stopped beside a weathered stone marker, almost concealed beneath ivy. Adrian remained behind a cluster of windswept pines, watching in complete silence. Emma knelt, reached into her satchel, and removed the wooden box. Then she unfolded a small hand shovel, dug patiently into the earth, and lowered the box into the shallow hole with extraordinary care. She covered it with soil, pressed both palms gently against the ground, closed her eyes, and stood perfectly still, while the ocean roared below the cliffs. Her lips moved as though speaking to someone Adrian could neither see nor hear. After several moments, she touched the stone marker softly with her fingertips, turned around, and walked back toward her car without ever glancing behind her. Adrian waited until the sound of her engine disappeared. Only then did he step into the clearing. Fresh earth rested beneath his shoes. The small shovel remained beside the grave-like patch of soil. His pulse slowed into the calm rhythm that always preceded difficult decisions. He crouched and extended his hand toward the ground. Dig, and 12 years of unanswered questions might finally end. Walk away, and he could continue believing trust required silence. His fingers wrapped around the shovel handle before stopping. For reasons he could not explain, he carefully placed it back exactly where Emma had left it. Some boundaries, once crossed, could never be restored. He turned away and returned home believing he had made the right choice. That evening, Emma cooked his favorite meal, laughed softly at one of his rare jokes, and hummed the same gentle melody she always seemed to remember on their anniversary. Adrian listened more carefully than ever before and realized he had heard that melody for years without truly hearing it. Later that night, unable to sleep, he wandered through the mansion until the vibration of his phone shattered the silence. Marco, his chief of security, spoke without greeting. "Sir, we have a problem." Adrian's expression hardened instantly. "Talk." "One of our surveillance teams spotted an unidentified sub following Mrs. Moretti this afternoon." Adrian froze. "From where?" "From the estate." A heavy pause settled between them. "Did they lose it?" Marco inhaled slowly. "No, sir." Another pause. "It was already waiting near the lighthouse before she arrived." Adrian did not sleep for more than an hour that night. Long after Marco ended the call, he remained in the security room watching the same footage over and over again, hoping the next replay would reveal something the previous one had missed. The black SUV appeared only briefly, parked just beyond the estate's outer cameras before following Emma at a careful distance. Whoever was inside knew exactly how to avoid attracting attention. They never drove too close, never accelerated, and never gave Adrian's surveillance team a reason to classify them as an immediate threat. That level of discipline troubled him more than recklessness ever could. By sunrise, every available report sat neatly arranged across his desk. License plate recognition had failed. Traffic cameras lost the vehicle near the coastal road. Facial recognition found nothing. It was as though the SUV had appeared from nowhere and vanished into thin air. Adrian had spent years dismantling organizations that believed they could disappear behind careful planning, and he knew one truth better than anyone. People erase their tracks only when protecting something valuable, or hunting it. Emma entered the kitchen just after 7, carrying 2 cups of coffee, unaware that Adrian had already been awake for hours. She smiled gently when she saw him standing by the window. "You're home early." He accepted the cup without taking his eyes off the ocean beyond the cliffs. "Couldn't sleep." She studied his face for a brief moment, sensing the weight behind his calm expression. But she chose not to press him. That had become another quiet habit in their marriage. Years ago, she would have asked what troubled him. Years ago, he might even have answered. Now they protected each other with silence, believing it was kindness, when in truth, it had become distance. During breakfast, Adrian noticed details he had ignored for years. Emma still stirred her coffee exactly 3 times before taking the first sip. She still tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear whenever she concentrated on reading the morning headlines. She still thanked the housekeeper by name every single day. None of those habits had changed, only his attention had. After she left for her bookstore, Adrian summoned Marco and the head of his security division. "From this moment forward," he said quietly, "Mrs. Moretti is under full protection." Marco nodded. "Without informing her." Adrian hesitated, especially without informing her. He knew Emma would never accept bodyguards following her through the city. She valued ordinary life more than luxury, and Adrian had always admired that about her. But admiration no longer outweighed caution. "Find out who owns the SUV," he continued. "I don't care how long it takes." Marco slid another file across the desk. "There's something else." Adrian opened it. Inside were aerial photographs of the abandoned lighthouse taken over several months, every anniversary, every year. Emma arrived alone. She stayed almost exactly 1 hour. She buried something. She left. Adrian slowly turned each photograph until one detail caught his attention. In the earliest images, the patch of disturbed earth appeared closer to the stone marker. In later years, the location shifted slightly, forming a gentle curve. 12 separate burial sites, not one. His eyes narrowed. Emma had not been visiting the same place. She had been creating a pattern. Later that afternoon, Adrian drove back to the lighthouse alone. The wind felt colder than the previous day, carrying the scent of salt and approaching rain. He walked slowly across the clearing, studying the ground with new awareness. Once he recognized the subtle differences in the soil, the pattern became impossible to ignore. 12 small resting places stretched in a graceful arc facing the ocean. Each had weathered naturally over time, until only someone searching carefully would notice. He knelt beside the oldest one. The temptation to dig returned stronger than before. Every instinct told him the answers lay only inches beneath the earth. Yet another voice reminded him that those boxes belonged to Emma's trust, not his curiosity. He stood again and looked toward the sea. "What are you trying to tell me?" he whispered, though no one answered except the waves below. As he turned to leave, a glint of metal caught his attention near the base of the stone marker. Half buried beneath loose gravel rested a small brass compass, tarnished by years of wind and rain. Adrian picked it up carefully. The glass was cracked and the needle no longer pointed north. Someone had engraved 2 words on the back. Asterisk, keep going. He frowned. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Before he could examine it further, Marco's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Sir, we've identified another vehicle approaching your location." Adrian instinctively scanned the empty road leading toward the lighthouse. A silver sedan climbed the hill at a steady pace before stopping several yards away. The driver stepped out slowly. It was an elderly man carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. He looked at Adrian without surprise, as though he had expected to find him there. "You're late," the old man said softly. Adrian's expression hardened. "Do I know you?" The stranger smiled with quiet sadness. "No, but your wife knows me." He glanced toward the stone marker before adding, "She asked me to come every year, in case one day you finally decided to follow her." The old man's voice carried no accusation, only the quiet certainty of someone who had been waiting for a moment that had taken years to arrive. Adrian studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deception. But all he found were weathered hands, tired eyes, and a face marked more by grief than fear. The bouquet of wildflowers rested gently against the man's arm as he walked toward the stone marker, removing his cap before placing the flowers at its base. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The wind filled the silence with the distant rhythm of crashing waves. "Who are you?" Adrian finally asked. "My name is Thomas Hale," the man replied. "I kept this lighthouse for nearly 30 years before the city abandoned it." Adrian glanced toward the towering structure behind them. Its cracked windows reflected the afternoon sun like fading memories. "Emma has been coming here since long before she became Mrs. Moretti," Thomas continued. That single sentence stopped Adrian's thoughts. He had always assumed her visits began after their marriage. The possibility that this place had belonged to her long before he entered her life had never crossed his mind. Thomas slowly walked toward the old lighthouse door, brushing his fingers across the peeling paint as though greeting an old friend. "She used to volunteer here during college," he said. "She helped me catalog old navigation logs when everyone else believed this place had nothing left worth saving." Adrian followed a few steps behind, saying nothing. He was beginning to realize how much of Emma's life existed outside the stories she had ever shared with him. They entered the circular building. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight that slipped between broken shutters. Rusted gears, abandoned lanterns, and shelves filled with aging journals surrounded them. The air smelled of salt, old paper, and damp wood. Thomas unlocked a small cabinet hidden beneath the spiral staircase and carefully removed a thick leather ledger. "Emma asked me to protect this," he said. Adrian instinctively reached for it, but Thomas gently held it back. "Not yet." Adrian's expression darkened. "You're asking me to trust someone I've never met?" Thomas smiled faintly. "No, Mr. Moretti, I'm asking you to trust your wife." The words landed harder than Adrian expected. For years he had believed trust meant giving Emma space. Now he wondered whether true trust required something much more difficult, the willingness to understand her before demanding answers. Thomas placed the ledger back inside the cabinet and locked it again. "She told me there would come a day when you finally followed her here. But she also said you wouldn't be ready." Adrian folded his arms. "Ready for what?" Thomas looked toward the ocean through the broken window. "To see your marriage through her eyes." Adrian felt an unfamiliar tightening in his chest. No rival had ever spoken to him with such calm confidence. No negotiation had ever left him feeling so defenseless. Before he could ask another question, Marco's phone call interrupted the silence. "Sir," Marco said urgently, "we found the SUV." Adrian stepped outside to hear more clearly. "Where? Abandoned in an industrial district. It was stolen 3 weeks ago. Any prints? Nothing useful. Whoever used it cleaned everything." Adrian looked back toward Thomas, who stood patiently beside the lighthouse door, as though he already knew the conversation would end without answers. "There's more," Marco continued. "Our cyber team recovered partial footage from a traffic camera. The SUV wasn't only following Mrs. Moretti yesterday." Adrian's voice became dangerously quiet. "Explain." "We've confirmed similar sightings on the exact same date for at least the past 4 anniversaries." Adrian remained perfectly still. Someone had watched Emma's annual visits for years. Not days, not weeks, years. "Send every file to my office," he ordered before ending the call. When he turned back, Thomas was looking toward the stone marker with an expression Adrian could not quite understand. It wasn't fear, it wasn't regret, it looked more like relief. "She always believed this day would come," Thomas said softly. "She just hoped it wouldn't come too late." Adrian's instinct sharpened immediately. Too late for what? Thomas hesitated for the first time since they met. His eyes drifted toward the weathered path leading away from the lighthouse. Fresh tire tracks crossed the gravel, darker than those left by Adrian's car only an hour earlier. Thomas noticed them too. His face lost its calm. "You weren't followed here today, were you?" Adrian didn't answer. Instead, he slowly scanned the surrounding cliffs, every sense suddenly alert. The ocean remained restless below. Gulls circled overhead, and the wind carried only the sound of distant waves. Yet something had changed. The stillness no longer felt peaceful, it felt occupied. Adrian stepped closer to the edge of the clearing and noticed another detail that hadn't been there when he arrived. Hidden between the tall grass near the path lay the crushed remains of a fresh white lily. Thomas stared at the flower, his expression turning pale. "Emma always brought white lilies," he whispered, "but she never left them on the ground." Adrian bent down and picked up the broken stem. The petals were still damp, as though they had been dropped only minutes earlier. He looked toward the empty road, then back at the lighthouse. Someone else had been there after Emma's last visit, someone who knew exactly what this place meant to her. And for the first time since this mystery began, Adrian realized he wasn't the only one searching for whatever had been buried beneath the old lighthouse. Adrian slipped the crushed white lily into the inside pocket of his coat without saying another word. Flowers were never evidence in his world, yet something about the broken stem felt deliberate, as though whoever had been there wanted someone to notice its absence rather than its presence. Thomas remained unusually quiet while they walked back toward the lighthouse. The old keeper paused at the doorway before speaking. "Emma never came here carrying flowers for herself," he said softly. "She always brought one for someone else." Adrian stopped. "Who?" Thomas looked toward the sea instead of answering. "That isn't my story to tell." Under different circumstances, Adrian would have pushed harder. Instead, he realized every person connected to Emma seemed to share the same quiet loyalty. None of them lied, they simply refused to reveal what they believed belonged to her. It was a kind of trust he had rarely inspired in his own world, where secrets were traded like currency. As he drove back toward the city, Marco called again with another update. The surveillance team had reconstructed the route taken by the stolen SUV during the previous afternoon. It never approached Emma directly. Instead, it remained just far enough away to observe every movement before disappearing several minutes after she left the lighthouse. Whoever was inside knew her schedule, Marco explained. Not just yesterday, every year, almost to the minute. Adrian tightened his grip on the steering wheel. That meant Emma's anniversary ritual had never been private. Someone had studied it patiently, waiting for the right moment to act. When he arrived home just before sunset, the mansion appeared exactly as it always had. The fountains flowed quietly. Garden lights illuminated the stone paths. Staff members moved through the halls with practiced calm, yet Adrian noticed something he had ignored for years. Emma's car was still missing. She had told him she would spend the afternoon at her bookstore after leaving the lighthouse, but she was never late without calling. He dialed her number. It rang until voicemail answered. He tried again. No response. He told himself not to overreact. Emma often silenced her phone while organizing new arrivals or speaking with customers. Still, an uneasiness settled over him that refused to leave. 30 minutes later, he was already driving toward Harbor Lights Books, the small independent bookstore Emma had purchased 5 years earlier. She had called it the one place in the city where people still slowed down long enough to think. Adrian had visited only twice. Each time he stayed less than 10 minutes before business pulled him elsewhere. The bell above the bookstore door chimed softly as he stepped inside. Warm light spilled across wooden shelves lined with novels, history books, and children's stories. The scent of coffee and old paper filled the air. A young employee looked up from arranging a display table and smiled politely until she recognized Adrian. Her expression shifted into surprise. "Mr. Moretti, is Emma here?" The young woman hesitated. "She left almost 2 hours ago." Adrian frowned. "Did she say where she was going?" "No, she just received a phone call, looked concerned, I guess, and left in a hurry." "Did she mention who called?" The employee shook her head. "She only apologized and said she'd close early." Adrian thanked her quietly before walking through the shop. For the first time, he noticed framed photographs hanging along one wall. Emma stood beside local school children during reading events. Elderly volunteers, authors, charity organizers, smiling faces filled every frame. In nearly every picture, she stood in the center, making everyone around her feel important. Adrian searched the wall instinctively. There wasn't a single photograph of them together, not because she had removed them, because he had never been there when those memories were made. The realization settled heavily in his chest. His phone vibrated. Marco again. "Sir, we found Mrs. Moretti's vehicle." Adrian's heartbeat slowed into dangerous calm. "Where?" "Parked behind an old train station on the east side." "Is she inside?" A brief silence answered him first. "No, sir." Adrian was already moving toward the exit. By the time he reached the station, flashing lights from local police cruisers reflected across cracked pavement. Emma's car sat alone beneath a broken street lamp, perfectly locked, with her handbag still resting on the passenger seat. There were no signs of a struggle. No broken windows, no blood, nothing except an overwhelming sense that she had vanished in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Detectives searched the surrounding area while officers questioned nearby shop owners, but no one remembered seeing Emma leave. Adrian walked slowly around the vehicle until something caught his attention beneath the driver's side door. A single grain of white sand clung to the rubber seal. He crouched, rubbing it gently between his fingers. It wasn't construction dust, it was coastal sand, identical to the pale shoreline beneath the abandoned lighthouse. Marco approached carefully. "What do you think?" Adrian looked toward the darkening horizon. "I think she never made it as far from the lighthouse as we believe." Before Marco could respond, Adrian noticed a folded bookstore receipt trapped beneath the windshield wiper. It hadn't been there earlier. Someone must have placed it there after the car was abandoned. He unfolded the paper. Nothing was written on the front, but when he turned it over, 3 words had been pressed into the back hard enough to leave faint impressions through the thin paper. Asterisk, "Stop digging now." Adrian stared at the message in complete silence. Whoever had written it knew exactly what he had been doing, and that meant someone had been watching him just as closely as they had been watching Emma. The 3 words haunted Adrian long after the police sealed off the area around Emma's abandoned car. Asterisk, "Stop digging now." The warning was not written in anger. It was written with confidence. Whoever left the message believed they controlled the next move. Adrian slipped the receipt into his pocket and slowly looked around the empty station. The building had been closed for years, yet someone had chosen it carefully. There were security cameras, but most had stopped working long ago. There were dozens of exits through abandoned service tunnels. There were enough forgotten corners for a person to disappear without anyone noticing. It was the kind of place designed by time itself to erase evidence. Detective Laura Bennett, the officer leading the investigation, approached him with measured professionalism. Unlike most people, she did not seem intimidated by Adrian's reputation. "Mr. Moretti," she said, "we've searched the vehicle. There's no indication of violence." Adrian kept his eyes on Emma's car. "That doesn't mean she left willingly." Laura nodded. "No, it doesn't, but it also doesn't mean she was taken by force. Sometimes the cleanest scenes are carefully staged." Her words echoed the conclusion Adrian had already reached. This had been planned. Every step, every location, every message. Someone wanted him searching in exactly the wrong direction. By midnight, the investigation expanded across the city. Adrian's private security teams worked alongside investigators, reviewing traffic cameras, interviewing witnesses, tracing phone records, and following every possible lead. Nothing. Emma's phone had gone dark less than 20 minutes after she left the bookstore. Her credit cards had not been used. No ransom demand arrived, no anonymous call, no threats. The silence was more terrifying than any demand for money could have been. It suggested that whoever had taken her wanted something far more valuable than wealth. Near dawn, Adrian returned alone to Harbor Lights Books. The little shop was dark except for the reading lamp behind the front counter, which the young employee had forgotten to switch off before leaving. He unlocked the door with the spare key Emma had insisted he keep years earlier. Until tonight, he had never used it. The quiet inside felt strangely personal, as though every shelf carried a small part of Emma's life that he had never truly known. He walked slowly through the aisles, touching the spines of books she had personally recommended to customers. Handwritten notes peeked from display tables. This story reminds us that forgiveness is stronger than pride. Read this when the world feels too loud. Hope is rarely dramatic, it usually arrives quietly. Adrian realized every recommendation sounded like something Emma herself believed. Behind the counter, he found her appointment calendar, school visits, community reading nights, charity book drives, meetings with struggling local authors. Every week was full of commitments she had honored without seeking recognition. His own schedule, by comparison, was filled with negotiations, security briefings, and financial reviews. For the first time, he wondered whether they had been living in the same city while quietly belonging to different worlds. As he closed the calendar, something slipped from between its pages. A small bookmark landed on the floor. On one side was the bookstore's logo. On the other, Emma had written a single sentence in blue ink months earlier. The hardest people to find are the ones who don't want to be rescued the wrong way. Adrian read the line again. It felt less like a quotation and more like advice. Advice she had somehow left behind before any of this happened. His phone rang. Marco. Sir, we've identified the number that called Mrs. Moretti before she left the bookstore. Adrian answered immediately. Who owns it? No one. It's a prepaid phone purchased with cash 3 days ago. Any location? Yes. Marco paused. The first signal came from the coastal highway. Adrian's pulse quickened. Near the lighthouse. Exactly. Adrian closed his eyes. The lighthouse, the SUV, the buried boxes, the white lily. Every road still led back to the same place. Before he could respond, another call came through on his second phone. Detective Bennett, he answered without hesitation. We found a witness, she said, an elderly taxi driver. Adrian remained silent. He remembers seeing Mrs. Moretti yesterday afternoon. Where? Near the old station. Adrian's grip tightened around the phone. Was she alone? At first. A long pause followed. Then she got into another vehicle. Adrian's voice became almost a whisper. Did she know the driver? Detective Bennett inhaled slowly. According to the witness, she opened the passenger door before the car even stopped. She didn't hesitate. She looked like she was expecting whoever had arrived. The words struck harder than Adrian expected. Emma had not been dragged into a car. She had entered it willingly. Every instinct inside him rejected the conclusion, yet every fact seemed to support it. After the call ended, Adrian stood alone in the center of the bookstore while dawn slowly brightened the windows. He looked around at the shelves Emma loved, at the notes she had written for strangers, at the quiet life she had built beyond the reach of his empire. For years he had feared betrayal from enemies. Now he feared something far more complicated. What if Emma had been protecting someone? What if she had walked away because she believed it was the only way to keep another promise? Before Adrian could gather his thoughts, the bell above the bookstore door rang softly. He turned instinctively. No one stood outside. Only a small parcel rested on the welcome mat. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. Inside lay a weathered brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. There was no letter, no explanation, only a tiny engraved tag hanging from the key. Asterisk box number 1. Adrian stared at the old brass key resting in his palm, long after the delivery courier had disappeared from the bookstore security cameras. It was heavier than it looked, worn smooth by years of careful use, with a faded blue ribbon tied through the small ring at its top. The engraved tag, box number 1, offered no explanation, yet it immediately pulled his thoughts back to the abandoned lighthouse and the 12 places where Emma had buried the wooden boxes over the years. Whoever left the package knew exactly where his investigation had begun. More unsettling still, they wanted him to continue. Detective Laura Bennett arrived less than 20 minutes later after Adrian called her personally. She examined the wrapping paper, the ribbon, and the key before handing everything to the forensic team. "If this is from the person who took Emma," she said, "they're controlling the pace of this investigation." Adrian remained calm, turning the duplicate tag between his fingers. "Or Emma arranged this herself." Laura looked up. "You believe she planned for someone to deliver it?" Adrian thought of Thomas Hale, of the lighthouse, of the buried boxes, and of the quiet certainty with which the old keeper had spoken. Emma had expected him to come eventually. Maybe she had never expected to explain everything herself. "She planned for possibilities," Adrian answered quietly. "Emma always did." Within the hour, Adrian and Laura returned to the lighthouse, accompanied only by a small forensic unit that remained well outside the clearing. Adrian insisted that no one disturb the remaining burial sites until they understood what they were dealing with. Standing before the oldest patch of earth, he removed the brass key from his pocket and noticed something he had missed before. Carved into the weathered stone marker was a tiny symbol almost invisible beneath layers of moss. A simple number 1 enclosed within a circle. The marking aligned perfectly with the oldest burial place. Thomas had been right. The sites had never been random. They had been organized from the beginning. Adrian knelt slowly, this time without hesitation. The warning left on Emma's abandoned car echoed in his memory. "Stop digging." Now he ignored it. Every careful movement through the soft earth felt strangely personal, not like uncovering evidence, but like stepping into a conversation that had waited years to begin. After several minutes, his fingers touched wood. The small box emerged intact, its surface protected by layers of waxed cloth that had preserved it from moisture. A tiny brass lock secured the lid. Adrian inserted the key. It turned smoothly with a soft metallic click. Laura stood silently beside him. Neither of them expected money, documents, or weapons. What they found instead was astonishingly ordinary. Inside rested a tiny paper sailboat folded from the corner of an old bookstore receipt. Beside it lay a smooth white seashell no larger than a coin. Nothing else. No letter. No explanation. Laura frowned. "That's it." Adrian carefully lifted the sailboat. On its underside, written in Emma's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 simple words. The first promise should never sink. He read the sentence twice before unfolding the fragile paper. Hidden inside was a date. June 18, 13 years earlier, their first anniversary. Memory returned with unexpected clarity. Rain had ruined the dinner reservation. Adrian had spent weeks arranging. Instead of complaining, Emma had laughed, folded a paper boat from the restaurant receipt, and floated it across a puddle outside, while insisting that imperfect days often became the most unforgettable ones. Adrian had laughed with her then. It was one of the last carefree evenings they ever shared before responsibility began consuming every empty space between them. He looked at the seashell next. Suddenly he remembered where it had come from. Emma had picked it up during an early morning walk along the coast after convincing him to take an entire weekend away from work. He had almost canceled the trip because of a business meeting. She had quietly placed the shell in his jacket pocket before they drove home, telling him, "Now you'll always have proof that you once took a day off." Adrian had completely forgotten the shell. Emma never had. Laura watched his expression soften. "These aren't clues about a crime," she observed. Adrian slowly shook his head. "No." His voice carried more regret than certainty. "They're clues about us." Before either of them could examine the box further, Marco hurried up the path carrying a tablet in one hand. "Sir, we recovered security footage from a marina less than 2 miles away." Adrian stood immediately. The video showed Emma leaving the lighthouse the previous afternoon exactly as expected. But 5 minutes later, another figure entered the clearing after she had already gone. The person's face remained hidden beneath a hood, yet one detail was unmistakable. They did not dig up any of the buried boxes. Instead, they carefully placed something beside the oldest marker before walking away. Adrian looked down at the empty space where he had found the brass key. "The key," he murmured. Laura nodded slowly. "Whoever that was, they wanted you to open the first box." Marco zoomed in on another frame captured moments before the figure disappeared. Around the stranger's wrist was a silver bracelet engraved with an intricate compass rose. Thomas Hale, standing silently near the lighthouse entrance after arriving unnoticed during the excavation, turned pale the instant he saw the image. Adrian noticed the change immediately. You recognize it. Thomas closed his eyes for a brief moment before answering. I prayed you would never see that bracelet again. Adrian stepped toward him. Tell me whose it is. The old lighthouse keeper looked from Adrian to the opened box, then back toward the sea. His shoulders seemed to carry the weight of years. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost lost beneath the crashing waves. It belonged to the only person Emma ever asked me not to trust. Thomas's words settled over the clearing with a weight that seemed to silence even the wind. Adrian did not interrupt him. He had learned more about his wife during the past 48 hours than he had allowed himself to learn in the previous 12 years, and every answer had arrived only after he stopped demanding immediate explanations. Thomas lowered himself onto the worn stone bench outside the lighthouse, his tired eyes fixed on the restless ocean. Her name was Vivian Cross, he began quietly. She volunteered here with Emma when they were both in college. They were inseparable for years. If Emma trusted anyone besides you, it was Vivian. Adrian listened without moving. What happened? Thomas sighed. One afternoon, Emma discovered that historical artifacts stored in this lighthouse were disappearing. Someone was selling them through private collectors. She confronted Vivian because she believed she had unknowingly become involved with the wrong people. He paused, shaking his head slowly. Vivian denied everything. Emma wanted to believe her. She always wanted to believe the best in people. Adrian looked at the silver bracelet frozen on the tablet screen. But she was lying. Thomas nodded. Not completely. Vivian wasn't stealing for herself. She had fallen under the influence of men who knew how to exploit loyalty. She promised Emma she would walk away, and for a while it seemed she had. Laura Bennett folded her arms thoughtfully. Until now, Thomas repeated. Adrian's mind raced through every detail they had uncovered: the surveillance, the abandoned SUV, the anonymous warning, the brass key deliberately left beside the oldest marker. None of it fit the pattern of someone trying to destroy Emma's memories. Whoever orchestrated this wanted Adrian to discover them in a specific order. Emma knew Vivian came back, Adrian said quietly. Thomas looked at him with quiet admiration. Yes, but she never believed Vivian was the one truly making the decisions. Laura stepped closer. Then who was? Thomas answered with painful certainty. Someone neither of you has met yet. Before anyone could respond, Marco's phone rang. He listened for only a few seconds before covering the receiver. Sir, our cyber team recovered deleted emails from Mrs. Moretti's bookstore account. Adrian took the phone. Send everything. Minutes later, dozens of restored messages appeared on his tablet. Most concerned community events, book donations, and literacy programs. One thread, however, had been permanently deleted only 3 days earlier. The sender used no name, only an encrypted address. The final message contained a single sentence. This year you won't have to carry the boxes alone. Adrian felt a chill run through him. Emma had known someone planned to meet her at the lighthouse. She had not gone there by accident. She had expected a conversation. Laura continued reading through the recovered correspondence until another attachment appeared. It was a scanned photograph taken more than a decade earlier. Emma stood smiling beside Thomas outside the lighthouse. Next to her was a young woman wearing the same silver compass bracelet visible in the marina footage. Adrian studied Vivian's face carefully. She looked kind, intelligent, completely ordinary. Nothing about the photograph suggested danger. On the back of the image, handwritten in Emma's neat script, were the words, "Some friendships deserve a second chance. Some don't survive the truth." Adrian slipped the photograph into his jacket beside the crushed white lily. He was beginning to understand that Emma had never buried the boxes because she feared the past. She buried them because she believed memories deserved context, not conclusions. Each object preserved a moment before pain distorted it. Each box reminded her that love could still exist, even when trust became complicated. Marco interrupted again. Sir, Detective Bennett needs to hear this too. He switched the call to speaker. One of the forensic analysts spoke rapidly. We finished examining the paper sailboat from box number 1. The paper fibers contain microscopic traces of blue pigment. Laura frowned. Ink? No. Marine paint, the same specialized coating used on maintenance doors inside the lighthouse before it closed. Adrian looked instinctively toward the spiral staircase. Thomas's expression changed. The maintenance level, he whispered. I forgot it even existed. What maintenance level? Adrian asked. Thomas hesitated only a moment. There's a hidden storage chamber beneath the lighthouse. Very few people know about it anymore. Emma helped me catalog everything down there years ago. Adrian's heartbeat quickened. Why didn't you mention it before? Thomas lowered his eyes. Because she asked me never to open it unless every box had been found, or unless she failed to come back. Silence filled the room. Emma had failed to come back. Thomas reached into his coat and slowly removed another key, older than the brass one Adrian already carried. Unlike the first, this key was black iron, heavy and worn by decades of use. He placed it carefully into Adrian's hand. This opens the chamber beneath the lighthouse, he said. I promised Emma I would never give it to anyone while she could still return for it herself. Adrian closed his fingers around the cold metal. He understood the weight of the promise Thomas had carried all these years. Laura shined her flashlight toward the circular stone floor beneath the staircase. After several minutes of searching, she stopped beside an iron ring almost completely hidden beneath layers of dust. Together, she and Adrian pulled upward. The ancient trapdoor groaned before slowly lifting, releasing a rush of cool air from the darkness below. Narrow stone steps disappeared into shadows untouched for years. Adrian aimed his flashlight into the passage. At the bottom, just beyond the reach of the light, something reflected briefly before disappearing again. It wasn't another box. It wasn't old equipment. It was the unmistakable gleam of a polished camera lens, and somewhere beneath the lighthouse, a quiet mechanical click echoed through the darkness as if someone had just taken their photograph. Writing, the sharp click of the camera echoed through the underground chamber before silence swallowed it again. Adrian reacted instantly, moving down the narrow stone staircase with controlled speed while Laura Bennett followed close behind, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Marco and two members of Adrian's security team entered second later, securing the entrance above them. The chamber was larger than anyone expected. Rows of rusted metal shelves stretched along damp stone walls, filled with weathered navigation logs, sealed crates, and forgotten equipment from decades earlier. Dust covered almost everything except a single corner where fresh footprints disturbed the floor. Whoever had taken the photograph had been there only moments before. Adrian swept his flashlight across the room until the beam stopped on a compact digital camera lying deliberately on an old wooden table. It had not been dropped. It had been left behind. Laura carefully picked it up using gloves before scrolling through the images stored on the memory card. The first photographs were years old, documenting restoration work inside the lighthouse. Emma appeared in several of them beside Thomas, smiling as they cataloged historical artifacts and clean, neglected rooms. Vivian appeared too, laughing beside Emma as if they had once shared complete trust. Then the timeline changed. The newer photographs no longer celebrated restoration. They documented surveillance. Emma arriving each anniversary. Emma burying another wooden box. Emma leaving alone. Someone had watched her ritual for years without ever revealing themselves. The final image froze everyone in place. It had been taken less than an hour earlier. It showed Adrian standing beside box number 1 while holding the paper sailboat in his hands. The photographer had been inside the underground chamber the entire time, watching through a narrow ventilation opening hidden behind the stone wall. They're still close, Marco said quietly. Adrian nodded. And they wanted us to find this. Laura continued examining the camera until she discovered a short video file, recorded only minutes before they arrived. She pressed play. The screen remained dark at first before a distorted voice spoke through electronic interference. If you're watching this, Mr. Moretti, then Emma trusted you enough to begin opening the boxes. That's more than I expected. Adrian's expression hardened. Who are you? Of course there was no answer. The recording continued. You're searching for the wrong prisoner. Emma was never taken because of what she knew. She walked away because she refused to let history repeat itself. The video ended abruptly. No face, no location, no further explanation. Laura looked at Adrian. They're still manipulating the narrative. Yes, Adrian answered, but they also made a mistake. She raised an eyebrow. Adrian pointed toward the ventilation shaft where the hidden camera had been positioned. Someone had to install that equipment recently. This chamber has been sealed for years. They left more than photographs behind. Within the next 2 hours, forensic investigators searched every inch of the underground room. Their patience was rewarded. Behind a loose stone near the ventilation opening, technicians recovered microscopic fibers, partial fingerprints, and fragments of adhesive used to secure modern surveillance equipment. More importantly, They found traces of rare industrial lubricant, commonly used in a single commercial shipping company operating out of the harbor. Laura immediately requested financial records, employment files, and security logs. By dawn, the investigation revealed an unexpected connection. Several employees of the shipping company had recently received payments from shell corporations linked to illegal trafficking of historical artifacts. Vivian Cross appeared nowhere in the ownership records, but her name surfaced repeatedly in archived communications as someone who had tried to expose the operation years earlier before suddenly disappearing from public life. Adrian leaned back in silence as the evidence accumulated. "She wasn't running the operation," he said. Laura nodded slowly. She was trapped inside it. The realization changed everything. Emma had never been protecting Vivian's crimes. She had been trying to protect a friend who had become a witness against people powerful enough to erase anyone standing in their way. Thomas lowered his head. Emma believed Vivian deserved one chance to make things right. Adrian looked toward the 12 burial sites outside the lighthouse, and when Vivian finally decided to testify, Laura finished the thought. Someone decided neither woman could be allowed to speak. Hours later, coordinated search warrants were executed across multiple warehouses connected to the trafficking network. Financial records, stolen artifacts, encrypted communication devices, and surveillance equipment were seized. Several senior organizers surrendered without resistance after realizing years of carefully hidden evidence had finally been connected. None of it required Adrian's influence. None of it required violence. Emma had always believed the truth became strongest when it could stand in daylight. Adrian honored that belief. He refused every suggestion from members of his own organization to settle the matter outside the legal system. "No revenge," he told them quietly. "Not this time." Marco studied him carefully before giving a respectful nod. "Mrs. Moretti would approve." Adrian offered the faintest smile, though it carried more sadness than relief. "That's the first decision I've made in a long time, hoping she'd approve." By evening, Laura entered the command center carrying another evidence folder. "We found Vivian," she said. Adrian stood immediately. "Alive." Laura nodded. "Alive, frightened, ready to testify." Adrian closed his eyes briefly in gratitude before asking the question that mattered more than any investigation. "And Emma?" Laura's expression softened. "Vivian gave us one statement before requesting legal protection. She placed a small digital recorder on the table. She said, 'Emma left something for you before they separated.'" Adrian pressed play. Vivian's trembling voice filled the room. "Emma said if Adrian ever chose to seek the truth instead of demanding answers, he'd know where to find her." The recording stopped. No address, no explanation, only one final clue. Adrian slowly lifted his eyes toward the large map hanging across the investigation wall. 12 burial sites, 1 lighthouse, 1 underground chamber, 1 missing woman. Then his gaze settled on a location everyone else had overlooked since the beginning. The place marked not with a number, but with a simple hand-drawn compass rose identical to the bracelet Vivian had once worn. Suddenly, for the first time since Emma disappeared, Adrian knew exactly where he needed to go next. Writing the compass rose on the investigation map pointed to a place no one had considered important anymore. It was not another lighthouse, another hidden chamber, or another forgotten landmark. It was the small coastal reading garden Emma had helped restore years earlier beside the city's oldest public library. Adrian remembered visiting only once, long enough to donate funds for the renovation before rushing back to work. Emma had stayed behind for the entire afternoon, reading stories to children beneath a circle of wind-shaped oak trees. At the time, Adrian believed he had done the important part by writing the check. Standing there now, he finally understood that Emma had always valued presence more than generosity. Before sunrise, Adrian drove there alone. The garden was quiet except for birds greeting the morning and waves rolling gently against the distant shore. Wooden benches surrounded a circular stone compass set into the ground, its bronze points worn smooth by countless footsteps. In the center stood a simple metal box attached beneath the compass by an old brass lock. Adrian removed the black iron key Thomas had entrusted to him. It fit perfectly. The lock opened with a gentle click. Inside rested a small recorder, a folded photograph, and one final wooden box, smaller than all the others. His hands trembled as he pressed the recorder's play button. Emma's familiar voice filled the morning air, calm and warm, as though she were sitting beside him instead of existing only through memory. "If you're listening to this, Adrian, Then you chose patience before certainty. Thank you. I always believed you would." He closed his eyes, letting her voice wash over years of silence neither of them had known how to break. "You probably think I disappeared because I stopped trusting you. The truth is almost the opposite. I trusted you enough to believe that, when the time came, you would choose the truth over anger." Vivian finally decided to testify against the people who used her. "They learned she was speaking with me. The safest way to protect everyone was to disappear before they could use me against you or against her. I wanted to tell you everything, but the investigation depended on secrecy, and every person who knew became another target." Adrian lowered his head, overcome not by guilt alone but by the painful realization that Emma had carried impossible burdens while trying to protect everyone around her. The recording continued. "If justice has already been done, then don't spend the rest of your life apologizing to ghosts. Live differently instead. Listen before you judge. Stay before you leave. Love people while they're still able to hear it." The recording ended with the soft sound of Emma laughing, followed by waves breaking against the shore. Adrian looked down at the folded photograph. It showed the two of them on the morning after their honeymoon, barefoot on a beach, smiling at each other instead of the camera. On the back, Emma had written only one sentence. "Our happiest days were never perfect. They were simply shared." Before Adrian could open the final wooden box, footsteps approached quietly across the stone path. Detective Laura Bennett appeared beside the garden entrance, smiling for the first time since the investigation began. "You should see this," she said softly. Adrian followed her to a nearby vehicle where Thomas waited patiently in the passenger seat. Beside him sat Vivian Cross, exhausted but finally free from years of fear. She held another small recorder. "Emma asked me to keep this until everything was over," Vivian whispered. "She wasn't sure she'd be able to return herself." Adrian accepted it without speaking. Vivian's eyes filled with tears. "She never stopped loving you. Even on the hardest days, she never spoke about leaving your marriage. She only worried that the man she fell in love with had become too busy carrying the world to notice he didn't have to carry it alone." Months passed. The trafficking network was dismantled through testimony, evidence, and lawful convictions. Stolen historical artifacts were returned to museums across the state. Thomas was honored for preserving decades of cultural history. Vivian entered a witness protection program and began rebuilding her life, finally free from the people who had controlled her for so long. Adrian changed more quietly than anyone expected. He reduced the responsibilities that had once consumed every waking hour and invested his time in the places Emma had loved most. Harbor Lights Books expanded into a literacy foundation, supporting small community libraries, children's reading programs, and historical preservation projects along the coast. Adrian attended every opening himself, not as the feared businessman whose reputation entered a room before he did, but simply as Emma's husband. He spoke little during those events. Instead, he listened. He stayed after everyone else had gone home. He learned the names of volunteers, teachers, and children. He discovered that kindness repeated often enough could become a legacy stronger than fear. On the first anniversary after the investigation ended, Adrian returned alone to the abandoned lighthouse carrying no bodyguards, no security teams, and no unanswered questions. The 12 places where Emma had buried her boxes remained untouched, protected now as carefully as any family treasure. He placed the final wooden box beneath the old stone marker without burying it. Some memories deserved to remain visible. Then he unfolded the paper sailboat once more and gently set it upon a shallow tide pool forming between the rocks below the lighthouse. The little boat floated steadily across the water before drifting toward the open sea. Adrian watched until it disappeared beyond the morning light. For the first time in many years, he did not feel the need to chase what was leaving. Emma had been right. The first promise should never sink. It should simply keep moving forward, carried by love, by truth, and by the courage to choose each other before silence ever had the chance to speak again.